Behind the Headlines on WLIW, our weekly opportunity to catch up with the award-winning journalists who cover the East End and do a deeper dive into the week's news. I'm Joe Shaw. I'm the executive editor of the Express News Group. We publish the Southampton Press, the East Hampton Press, the Sag Harbor Express, the website 27east.com, and Express Magazine. My co-host is Bill Sutton, managing editor of the Express News Group. Good morning, Bill.
Good morning, Joe. Good morning, everybody.
Good panel this week. We have Denise Civiletti, who's the editor of Riverhead Local. Hey, Denise.
Hey there, how are you?
We have Beth Young, who's the editor of the East End Beacon. Hey, Beth.
Morning.
And we have Gianna Volpe, who is the host of the Heart of the East End right here, well, not right here, on WLIW Radio, I should say. Welcome, Gianna.
Hello.
Right here if you're listening to us on the radio, I guess, but not right here. Anyway, so let's talk about public radio and public television. Yesterday, the Senate kind of made it official, and they have agreed not just to cut the funding to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, but they're going to claw back a lot of money over the 2-year period. Gianna, what's the fallout been at WLIW so far? What's the conversations over your way?
So that's yet to be seen. It's too new. But as a journalist, I'm thinking about the rural places in our country that are likely to be hit first by this stuff. Places where news deserts have already become so vast as they begin or have lost print publications, meaning that the local NPR or PBS stations may be among the few, if not the last bastion or access to information, places where people, can figure out what's going on. And with the dismantling of NOAA and the Department of Education, things like the emergency alert system and public broadcasting, and the valuable and storied educational program for kids in particular, it's a devastating moment.
It's going to have an impact on everyone, including WLIW, I'm sure. But I think you make a great point that there's a lot of places in the United States that are going to get hit particularly hard by this. I know the Daily from the New York Times did a great piece this past week where they talked to the folks at a radio station in Alaska, which covers an island that voted 2-1 for Trump. And they made the point that it's really going to impact the local stations in a much more severe way than it's going to impact NPR. It's really going to take a lot of the local programming off of those stations, and it's going to hit them the hardest. There's an irony to that, isn't there, Denise?
Absolutely. And, I think that's something that we're going to see with some other things as well, like, the Medicaid cuts when they are implemented and fully implemented. It's widely believed it's going to hit the so-called red states hardest. So
and we've
I don't
certainly
know what to
already
make of that
seen
irony.
that
I don't know what significant.
We've seen that already with the cuts to NOAA.
Yeah, it's already some of the cuts. I'm genuinely, it surprises me that when push came to shove, both the House and Senate went forward with this, because there were some Republicans who had some hesitation about it, I think. But Denise,
not many.
I know that Nick LaLota, our first district representative, when this issue was before the House, he was actually one of a couple of Republicans who voted against these cuts the first time around, right? Denise, do you remember?
Well, then
I couldn't quite make out what you were saying.
I think Nick LaLota, our first district representative, actually voted against the cuts the first time around.
He did, but then he was one of the two that changed his vote to have it squeak past the House. So that was pretty sad.
They ended up being deciding votes, I think, right, Beth?
Yeah. Yep. So
they were the two votes that pushed it over the edge. So what do we think this is what's the fallout going to be here on public television and public radio? What's the impact going to be locally? Let's start there.
Less programming.
Is that a conversation that's come up at all? Have there been conversations about what the impact is going to be, Gianna, on the radio station, on WNET? You know, those are really the big presence in our lives here on Long Island.
Right. We haven't gotten word. I saw an email from Neil, which was actually very heartening and filled me with a bit of hope. But we have to see. We have to see what happens. We have to see if folks out there are seeing what's going on and step up and step in. We aren't sure. I certainly hope.
It seems to me that the Corporation for Public Television is just going to need to pivot and change its model a bit, hopefully, and figure out a way to either solicit more donations or find some funding elsewhere, or work out a way to do different programming. I'm not sure anybody would know what the answer is at this point, but it's got to change. We've all pivoted as the industries have changed, and certainly,
Right.
We're newspaper reporters mostly here, and internet reporters, and we've pivoted as that industry has changed. We've had to, and it seems to me that public broadcasting is going to have to pivot and change a little bit too, hopefully.
And we will.
Yeah.
I'm feeling oddly energized by all of this. I know that our mission is an important one, and connecting people with information and non-biased news and, platforming the community. I mean, this is the type of stuff that is going to get us through a period like this. So, if adapting to new means or, pivoting in some way, I don't know. I'm feeling oddly hopeful because I know that listeners like ours get it and, will be with us every step of the way.
Let me play devil's advocate for
I
a minute.
never realized.
Good.
I'm
Go ahead,
sorry.
Denise.
I never realized about the emergency piece of this before, living as we do in such a media-rich environment, that like so many places rely on these local public radio stations to get information about like emergency situations as they occur. And as
Like
they
in
seem to be
Alaska,
occurring
it's very important
more
there.
and more frequently with fires and floods and storms and everything. And it's like this is really and truly, literally a lifeline to people.
Correct.
And I'm not disparaging in any way the importance of Long Island's only public radio station, which I love, but it's different in this market, and so that to me is really critical. And the other thing about this that I think bears, I mean, it's kind of like for us maybe stating the obvious, but this is all part of like political retribution campaign. I mean, the Republican Party has historically looked to cut funding from public radio and public television for a variety of reasons, I think having to do with their perceived, sort of liberal bias, or, I think that's something that has been said since most of my lifetime, which I guess dates back to like the beginning of public television and radio. But like, I think it's just really stepped up. And I think that the attacks on the news reporting, which is really, I mean, it's kind of one small aspect of what public radio and public television actually does, but that seems to be what the bug in the bonnet. And in his, kind of, let's say, unique way, the current president of the United States, when he puts a target on something or someone, this is kind of what results. And our Congress doesn't really seem to have any. They've kind of abdicated. I mean, what they've agreed to and what they're going to finalize, it looks like Thursday evening, is clawing back money that they previously approved,
Right.
spending they
Right.
previously approved and allocated. I mean, this isn't
And
even
it's 1/10
something going forward.
of 1% of the
Yeah.
budget. 1/10
Of
of
the federal
1% of the
budget.
budget.
Right.
Yes. And it's $1.60 per person. But the amount of value that is provided, and certainly and as a journalist, I look at the reporting being done by NPR and I'm proud. I look at the stuff, I don't see bias. I look at like the Gallup polls being the most trusted name in news. I think that this is all part of the attack on the free press that we saw with Trump 1. This is stuff that's just straight out of the authoritarian handbook. When you're
I mean,
calling
What I
the
think
press
is,
the enemy of the people.
go ahead, Beth.
Broadcast and television news is so politically polarized. I mean, you just have to sit and watch MSNBC, watch Fox News, and watch the NewsHour, and you
Yeah.
can see quite clearly how
Yes.
middle of the road
Very.
NPR coverage is, and it's trusted on account of that. And
Well,
that's
I mean, like Fox News and MSNBC, their primetime programming or all day. I don't even know anymore, but it's not even news. It's and Fox admitted that in papers filed in court. It's entertainment,
Right.
And I think the same is true of MSNBC. Like it's a different perspective, but you get more straight news if you watch like Channel 7 News or CBS News. You know what I mean? Like
I've gone back to
yes.
the broadcast commercial television.
A great recent example that I've seen is
they're also capitulating
a cut from remember the Flag Day birthday parade? There is a clip in which you see the PBS coverage and then the Fox coverage in which they inserted applause that was ramped down as soon as Trump began to speak. That's clear manipulation. So when, it's very insulting as a journalist seeing this type of demonization happening that is so far removed from the facts of the matter and what the truth is. So it's wild times.
I think Denise and Beth's point, though, is let's not single out Fox News. I mean, it goes both ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's absolutely
you're right.
true. I think there's
an irony
about that.
There's
an irony here too, because I think one of the only last hopes for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting might be in court. And it's interesting to me that the president, with his executive order in starting this whole process, talked about the biased media, cutting off the government funding to biased media, which means this is really being driven by content, which makes it a First Amendment issue.
And it's retribution.
And it very well could get some legs in court because of that. Because I think if the case can be made that this is about the content, forget whatever you think of NPR and PBS, and if you think there's a liberal bias, fine, but it's still not a reason you're not supposed to be cutting funding based on the content of the message.
Some people consider facts a liberal bias,
Right.
Let's just keep that in mind.
But
I agree with you,
started
Joe.
to say earlier, let me play devil's advocate for a minute. I wrote a newsletter piece about this for our subscribers over the weekend. And some of the response I got was interesting. I actually thought some of the folks who wrote back said, we shouldn't have government funding for a media organization, period. That we wouldn't have a government-funded newspaper. Why should the government be paying for media? We have a media landscape now. Maybe at the time NPR and public television began, this was an important thing because we needed to seed media outlets, but now because the information infrastructure is so big, we just don't need public funding anymore. What's the response to that?
I strongly disagree, especially when you talk about this media landscape, and that's most likely, I remember asking a friend of mine whom we differ politically on a number of things, asking what the sources for news were. And, you hear things like various websites and social media. And when social media, the way the algorithm
Things
works
that aren't
is that
news.
it's certainly not. There's no vetted information. You're getting anybody, out there with whatever conspiracy theory, and it's designed to feed you more extreme content and divisive content. I feel like
I think
having
directly to the point Joe just made, though, like, you know, yeah, maybe they needed more startup funding back when they started, but look at the actual media landscape today. What infrastructure? I mean,
Mhm.
actually, there are bills pending in Congress that are going nowhere, but to actually support news reporting and publications. Was one passed in New York State last year that would provide payments to by way of tax credits, actually, to newspapers and broadcast media, commercial entities, okay, to help support them because of the sharp decline in revenue tied into what you're saying, Gianna, because of social media, other sources of information that may or may not actually be news, but that people are relying on for information. And so, you
Mhm.
know, the news industry, it's no secret, is not in a healthy state, and
Right.
so I mean. I don't think that argument, Joe, really holds water for anybody who really is paying attention to this whole situation. Like,
For me, I see it more like the attacks you're continuing to see with something like the National Park Service, which thus far has been pretty good at fending off a lot of this stuff. But, when you're attacking organizations that whose economic output exceed what you're putting into it, I mean, as mentioned, it looks like a lot of money when you're putting together 2 years together. Oh, $8.8 billion. No, that's 1/10 of 1% of the federal budget. It's $1.60 per taxpayer per
Mhm.
year. And it funds a whole heck of a lot of good, and meaning that people are informed. And as a journalist, that's what we want. We want people to be informed so that they can make informed decisions about whatever is going on. That's
When
And I
when
period.
the government
personally,
started funding public broadcasting, though, it was a different landscape. And I'm not disagreeing with anybody, but it was a different landscaping. And I think a part of what what the government was trying to do at the time was guaranteeing there were a limited number of frequencies that radio stations and television stations could utilize. And so it was a method to guarantee that at least a portion of those frequencies, rather than being leased out or sold to different media companies, would remain in the public's trust. I think it's a different world now, though, because you have
Mm.
the internet and you have cable television, and it's not a matter of a limited number of frequencies anymore. And I think some of the people who are arguing against federal funding for public broadcasting would point that out, that it's a different world. And again, to my point, maybe it's time for, a pivot a little bit so that you're not depending on. I have no problem with the government funding public broadcasting, but you have to understand that it's also a limited audience that's benefiting from that public broadcasting. We're, we benefit because we're fans of public broadcasting and participate in WLIW, and we're fans of WNET group and all that. But there are a number of people in this country that don't want to watch
I have to tell you, Bill,
WNET programming or listen to public broadcasting programming. So I think the argument would be, and I'm not making this argument, but I'm saying the argument would be, why should the majority of Americans pay for that when you're not having the majority of Americans pay for the New York Times or the Washington Post or Fox News because they are delivering they are delivering content to a specific audience.
To your point,
If
Bill,
public broadcasting is delivering content to a specific audience, why should the entire government be paying for that? Would be the argument. And again, I'm not making that argument. I'm just being devil's advocate a little bit
to
here.
your point, what I thought was interesting, the Daily story that they did about the station in Alaska. The folks who complained about the types of stories that were being reported, not necessarily how they were being reported. It was just the choice of doing stories, and the specific was a lot of stories about LGBTQ topics, and people were upset at the choice that those were not choices that they would have made had they been in charge of setting the. But I feel like it's become sort of an accepted statement now that, oh, well, public radio, public television have a liberal bias. I actually have stopped getting news from any television sources, and I get almost all my news from NPR and from public television because exactly for that reason. I feel like they've filtered out so much of the commentary, and it really is back to the old days of just reporting on stories. Now you can argue that they choose topics that maybe don't have the breadth of appeal in some parts of the country, but I still think it has real value, and I think it's kind of a shame that the whole conversation now has become.
It certainly has real value, and if people find a value in it, people should support it.
Well,
does that mean that the government should support it? I think is the question. If we're going to have the conversation, if people,
I mean,
go ahead, Beth.
I think the thing is it's a very small amount of money compared with the federal budget, and it's kind of the same argument you could make for USAID. It's a lot less expensive to do this than to deal with the cleanup from having people be misinformed or uninformed, and that just goes that goes down to like warnings when when there's natural disasters, which are increasing in frequency. It's part of the emergency response system in this country, and that's big. And I think also, and I don't know if Gianna wants to speak to this at all, but I think the mix of local and national programming, and this, I believe the stations get to choose. I mean, and they also have to pay for the NPR programming that they have on the stations. That's correct, right? So they can choose which of the national programs they run and do their own local programming if they have the money for it. And that's a really powerful model because it makes the stations really responsive to the communities they're in.
Correct. And it's one of the most successful public-private partnerships that are going. And our stations look different to fit the specific communities that they are in. And, I think that the politicizing or making into a political thing, which is the same thing that we saw through the COVID-19 pandemic when it came to, public health practices. It's the same thing that you're seeing with history right now, when we're looking at, whitewashing history and telling the Smithsonian what exhibits to have or not. It's this encroachment of culture war stuff in inappropriate places, and I really object to it. As a journalist, I found, I've been a print reporter, I've been digital. I have found such a satisfaction as a journalist who always loved for the people and the sources to tell their story. Every single morning, I get to have someone from the public come in and tell their story. And it's like, it really goes straight to the center of what I learned at J school. It's very pure. So it's really it's a crazy making moment in American history for me and those like me who are seeing what's going on, and sort of it's sad because a lot of the people who have these differing opinions, we're not so different, and I feel like that this misinformation and sort of the rise of mis and disinformation, and this fact that conspiracy theory has spread faster than facts, has put us in a bit of a pickle. And I don't see enough people standing up for what are very, American ideals: truth, justice, and the American way, the freedom of speech. All of these things are under real attack right now. And it's hard to watch, but, I was reading this Gandhi quote this morning about, truth and love win in the end. So I'm just trying to make sure that we all weather the storm as best as we're able and find ourselves on the other side of this.
Denise, I'm going to give you the last word on this.
Love wins. That's what it is.
Yes, which you have with your shirt.
I mean, I just think there's an inherent value to publicly funded media. I think that it relieves reporters of and any kind of programmers of commercial pressures.
Amen.
Like you say, people should support it, but individuals don't necessarily support it. And we all know that when things are supported by advertising, it's an inherent problem that you really need to have a certain amount of courage to say, well, I'm sorry, this, because you guys know this, I think, I don't know, but as a publisher and editor, you get threatened with that all the time. Like, I'm not going to advertise with you anymore because I don't like what you wrote. I don't, that kind of thing happens all the time. You need to just have the courage of your conviction and say, well, you advertise with us because it's good for your business. We have a far reach, and not because you agree with us. And if that's all you're interested in, well, sorry, what can I say? And when, as a parent, when my children were little, I was able to, I knew that when I had on channel 21 or channel 13 and there was children's programming on, it was going to be, in a sense, safe for them.
Right.
It was educational, and it wasn't that, they weren't being like hawked,
bombarded with cereal commercials.
Right.
With a million commercials. And, now, of course, there are people who feel that the presence of LGBT characters in cartoons, or, I don't know, or even Ernie and Bert, honestly, it never occurred to me, but, that they get freaked out by that, and that upsets them as much as I'm upset by, what we used to call sugar pops when I was a kid, before there was public broadcasting. I don't know. I think there's inherent value in removing it from the commercial realm there. The other thing that I think is really important not to lose sight of here, you mentioned this, Beth, but, the public broadcasting piece of this clawback is 1.1 billion. The total is 9.1 billion. And so $8 billion of that 9.1 billion is for foreign aid assistance programs, which, they're basically, this is Congress abdicating its role, right? And validating and legalizing essentially what Trump did or tried to do with that executive order. And it's as short-sighted as can possibly be. And for a whole variety of reasons, but, public broadcasting is really only a little piece of this.
Yes.
And I think, honestly, this is just the beginning.
What is it? It's like 1.1 billion, I think.
Yeah, 1.1 billion out of like a $9.1 billion
Yeah, I mentioned that with the big number earlier, but you're right that the most of that was for USAID, of which they ended up incinerating, like, thousands, hundreds of thousands of pounds of food.
I'll go back to something Beth pointed out. The thing that bothers me as a local journalist is that this is going to have a significant impact on local reporting at a lot of these NPR stations. That is going to be the real cost here, and I think that we're going to regret that in the long run. And I'm afraid that the impact of that is going to be pretty severe. So something we'll keep an eye on as we go forward. This is Behind the Headlines on WLIW. I'm Joe Shaw. My co-host is Bill Sutton. We're with the Express News Group. Our panelists are Denise Civiletti of Riverhead Local, Beth Young of the East End Beacon, and Gianna Volpe of the Heart of the East End here at WLIW. I want to switch over to Southold, Beth, and talk about a project up your way. There was a hotel project up there that stalled, and you found out some information this week about that project.
Yes.
Give us a little bit of the background first.
So there's been a lot going on up here about this debate about whether the North Fork needs more hotels or not. And, there's rampant short-term rentals here as well as on the South Fork. And they're really eating up a lot of the housing stock. So that's the argument sort of that we might need more hotels because we're a wedding destination up here. And a lot of people come to town for the weekend and they need a place to stay. But also, the scale of hotel development out here has always historically been little small motels, very kind of quaint and traditional hotels. And a few years back, a group of local builders and developers came up with this project called the Enclaves that met with a lot of public pushback. It's a resort hotel on the main road in Southold, across from the Southold 7-Eleven. It's only a 6-acre property, but they were talking about a 44-room hotel and a conference center and 2 restaurants and several other major amenities. So it really met with a lot of derision in Southold, which doesn't have any sort of big hotels like that. It ended up getting tax breaks from the Suffolk County IDA over the objection of many people in Southold town government and the public. And as a result of the construction of this hotel, Southold, which is undergoing a zoning update, issued a moratorium on consideration of new hotel projects a year ago, and they just extended it for another year. But this was after this project was already approved. And so they got their approvals in 2023. They cleared the lot in February of 2024, just completely clear cut it. Before they got their building permit, they got special approval to do this because they said they had to do it in the wintertime because there were northern long-eared bats that lived there in it was their seasonal home. They weren't there in the winter. So they clear cut it, and then they dug some holes, and now there's just piles of sand everywhere, and it's been that way for a year and a half. And so their site plan expired last week, and they came into the planning board this week looking for an extension. And through this process, they revealed that they had lost $25 million in financing from Dime Bank that they had initially been committed to this $44 million project, and they're looking to find a way to fill this hole in their budget. So they say they've found new backers and they're going to start work again in September. But that is still the future and we don't know what's going to happen. But I think a lot of members of the public were a little surprised that that there was no pushback on the part of the planning board. It's very common to extend site plans. If you get a building permit, you get extensions often if you run into project problems. And now the site's already cleared, so they have a performance.
Probably the only thing worse than a hotel is a half-done hotel project as far as the community is concerned.
Yeah, and that's this
or just a cleared 6 acres.
Yeah,
cleared 6 acres, and this is also there's another hotel proposal on the main road in Mattituck that had started out at 200 rooms. It was the former Capital One headquarters, and their current proposal is for about 80 rooms, and that actually just got a waiver from the moratorium because their argument was that it was adaptive reuse of this site. and that it would be allowed under the new zoning as well. But whether that comes to fruition or not, that hasn't even started the planning board process yet. So we'll see. In the midst of all this, Southold has gotten this new software to track short-term rentals. It's called Rentalscape. I don't know if any of the other local towns are using it, but it's so detailed that they can like tell when people are checking in and when people are checking out from Airbnbs, and they could send a code
Wow.
enforcement officer there to
Really?
issue violations to people.
Investigate. Yeah.
Yeah, and
I
you know
think the
there.
towns they've really
Did you
been cracking
post?
down on that. We had a photo this week from Kate Rogers, who is an East Hampton town councilwoman, is looking into this issue of short-term rentals a little more closely. And it is pretty remarkable. And East Hampton town does allow people to rent out their houses twice a year for less than 2 weeks at a time.
Oh,
Uh,
interesting.
they're allowed to do that. But the cost of some of the rentals is just astronomical. And
Right.
I think it's been a sort of understated impact on the local affordable housing community. Because as Kate Rogers
Oh,
pointed out, a lot of the affordable housing, a lot of the short-term rentals in the region are owned by corporations. They're investors who buy these properties in order to do this short-term rentals because it's very profitable. But
And
it
those
right.
takes
short-term
And
rentals used to be long-term rentals at one
exactly,
point.
and
Yeah.
it
it's
just
a
takes them
huge
off the
piece.
market.
I mean, as someone who's rented here for a very long time, it was impossible, nearly impossible, to find a long-term rental and place to live because of that.
hmm
Yeah,
It's just completely gutted the rental market
Well,
throughout the
and I think
region.
it got worse after COVID too, because people just
Right.
snapped up a lot of those places too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah. Um, Southold is looking to revamp its code next in the fall. Currently, they don't allow rentals of less than 14 days, but this issue of the houses being owned by corporations is big everywhere. And when they did this analysis last year that led to what they're going to propose in the fall, they found that 40 of the short-term rentals in Southold town alone are owned by just 4 property management companies. So
Wow.
so they're really going to tailor their new code to be like it has to be an owner on site, and it has to be owned by a person, not a corporation. And I think that's going to
Very interesting.
quite a few
Which
things.
makes
Very
the
interesting.
development for affordable housing all the more critical.
Yeah,
But that may
Corporations
set,
are people too, remember?
yeah,
there's
that's
that.
true.
That's-
But that
there is
may
concern.
set them.
They were saying that
Southhold.
the circuit,
Go ahead,
the
Beth.
New York circuit, it might get through, but it wouldn't get through in a different circuit. But the courts are changing, so whether it's legally defensible is an open question.
I'll say this: Southold, if they come up with a strategy for doing that, may set an example for the other towns too. The other towns may follow that, because I think it's an issue that all the towns on the East End are looking at very closely. No question. Let me
I
switch
mean,
gears.
it's been impossible for the towns to enforce their short-term
Yeah.
rental regulations and prohibitions because it's a matter of manpower. But
Yeah.
if Southold has found software that will make that easier to do and be able to target some of these properties on the spot and get code enforcement out there, then I think that could be a game changer for a lot of the municipalities
I
out
think
here.
code revision is really a big piece of this too,
Yeah.
though, as
Yeah.
you're looking at it in Southold. I mean,
Yeah, they're
otherwise it's
totally
kind of
out
like
there.
you're just always playing whack-a-mole. I
Yeah.
guess.
Right.
It's just,
Well, I
So
mean,
if
And I think
they
that's
if it's complaint driven, you get the worst actors, but you don't get all of them, and then people wonder why
Right.
it's unfairly.
and it
perceived
takes
to
a
be
lot to build a
unfairly.
case.
Yeah.
Take them to
Yeah.
Supreme Court and get an injunction and everything, and that takes years after even once you're in court. And then Riverhead did this with a guy that owned property in Aquabog, and by the time they eventually got to court and went through all the motions, and they were working on a settlement and everything else, and then guess what? He sold it.
Hmm.
And they, good luck trying to collect it now. Like,
Yeah.
he
Hey,
agreed.
Denise, speaking of which, they have new code as far as driveways that's coming effective in November. Do you think that will affect the market at all?
As far as driveways, you said?
Yeah, you know the new driveway code? You have to have like
You're,
asphalt driveways. There's just like new regulations.
oh, yeah. And you're not supposed to park cars on your lawn and stuff like that. And I mean, I didn't realize that didn't take effect already. I'm sorry.
No, not till November. I'm just wondering if you thought it was going to have any effect at all.
That'll affect one of my neighbors.
I think it's going to be very selectively enforced.
Interesting.
That's very much so. Let me switch gears a little. We'll talk politics. Denise, there's a lot of conversations at the national level about the Democratic Party. You've got an interesting situation in Riverhead with the Democratic Party. What's going on up there?
Yeah, Alec Lewis reported out this story, and we published it this morning. It started for us with the Riverhead Democratic Committee posting on Facebook a comment about how one of their candidates was endorsed by the Long Island Democratic Socialist of America organization, and they said, we don't welcome this endorsement. It's not something that we wanted, and that's not who we are, and we're the party of the local blah blah blah. They were basically their hair was on fire about it, and which is in some ways understandable because hey, socialist is a dirty word, right?
Still is, right? Even though we're talking about Bernie Sanders and AOC and who kind of identify that way, but the word remains very difficult in political circles.
We have, it's also taken on, in my opinion anyway, as a student of politics and, majored in this and political science in college, like it's really kind of the definition of it in people's minds has really expanded. Like, if you listen to people on the, kind of the far right end of things, it's, anybody that believes in redistribution of wealth through taxation, income tax. And that, that wasn't part of that's not a definite income tax is not a socialist, tactic. But anyway, so there's this one gentleman who is a candidate. He's a registered Democrat. He's the only registered Democrat of the three people running on the Democratic slate for town board. The supervisor candidate and the other council candidate are not registered Democrats. They're both blanks, not registered to any party, and at the current time, anyway. And he had this on his resume, which he provided us with a copy of. The resume and cover letter that he sent to the Democratic Committee, which acknowledged that he was affiliated with this group. And I don't know if they didn't notice that it was on there or what, but they didn't say anything until this past weekend, or I guess I should say last weekend now, when they put this post up, and it was in response to a Newsday article that pointed out that this candidate, his name is Kevin Shea, lives in Bating Hollow. New York, was a New York City firefighter. Ground Zero, etc. He wrote a play about that. Actually, he's an interesting guy, but he was kind of highlighted in this Newsday article that was about the winner of the Democratic primary in New York City, the Democratic mayoral primary, Mr. Mamdani. And, apparently Kevin Shea is the only candidate affiliated with this Long Island Democratic Socialists of America party. It's not a party, sorry, organization. They came out and endorsed him in May, and it didn't become an issue anywhere until
this past weekend.
Until Newsday did this article, and so this weekend they jumped up and down and said that's not who we are. And then, interestingly enough, the supervisor candidate, who's a pastor of a non-denominational Christian church in Riverhead, his name is Jerry Halpin. Very nice guy, but he came out and said, I can't support him because of this. Like I don't support. I don't support this running mate. And then the other Democratic candidate running on the Democratic ticket for town board, council candidate Mark Woolley, was for former journalist. Actually, he worked for the News Review back in the '80s, and then he left and went to work for a long time at a newspaper called Suffolk Life, which some older folks among us maybe
Right.
remember.
And
With
why not?
with Gannon,
And why
with
not?
Tim Gannon, right?
Tim was there very briefly, but
Oh,
Mark,
okay.
Mark was there for quite a while. But anyway, Mark, I know him. He was with the News Review when I was on the Riverhead Town Board, so we've kind of like traded places. But anyway, he had kind of a career with as an aide to Republican elected officials, notably Lee Zeldin in the state Senate, and then in Congress. He was Lee Zeldin's district manager. And then when Lee Zeldin didn't run for re-election and decided instead to run for governor in 2022, Mark and George Santos was elected in New York 3. Mark went to work for George Santos as his district manager and served in that position for 1 year until Mr. Santos was expelled from Congress.
But just to be clear again, Mark is a Democratic candidate.
He's
in-
a Democrat.
in
Yes,
Riverhead.
he's on the
Yeah.
Democratic ticket, but he is not registered to any party at the current time.
So we should point out that the blanks, that phenomenon is pretty strong on the East End, right? About a third of the voters are not registered with one of the two parties. That's not that unusual, right?
Yeah, no, it's pretty strong in Riverhead too, in terms of people who are not registered to any party. I suspect we have a few of those on this Zoom right now. That describes me.
Mhm.
Yep,
Um,
I'm a blank.
But
too.
it's so the Democratic Party apparently is okay with running. I mean, this is not the first time that they have run people who are not registered Democrats. So this is what they did, and now the guy that is a Democrat is apparently expressing more like progressive or left-leaning sentiment than they're comfortable with. And there's this backlash, and it remains to be seen what happens. But before we went on, I referred to this as a dumpster fire. I think that's fair. It's like, they have not. This party has not typically had much success at the polls in Riverhead, and
I was
I
going to
think
say,
that-
I mean, the GOP's pretty much got a stranglehold on the board right now. I mean, it's an uphill battle
and has
to try
for some
to
time.
try to win an
Well,
election against a Republican right now in
the
Riverhead.
last time there were Democrats on the town board was when Laura Jen Smith, who ran and defeated Sean Walter, who was actually a registered conservative with Republican backing. But Laura Jen Smith, the Democrat, defeated him, and Catherine Kent also was elected that year. And the council term is 4 years. The supervisor term is 2 years. And after, when she ran for re-election, she was defeated by Yvette Aguiar,
Lauren
the
Kent
Republican
Smith was.
candidate.
I think Catherine Kent is the only Democrat on the board for.
I left Catherine Kent as the only Democrat on the board, and I can relate to that. I was in that position once myself, actually, back in a long 40 years ago or whatever it was.
And now
But,
Lauren Kent Smith is the head of the party.
And Laura Jen Smith's been the head of the party. She's also the chair, the president of the Greater Jamesport Civic Association.
Yeah. I
She
think
was
it's really,
a.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Go ahead, Beth.
I think the Democrats in Riverhead this year in particular seem to have completely different campaign ideas of how they're going to run their campaign, and all three of them are running it their way, kind of independent of each other. I mean, Mark Woolley has this really intense social media presence. It's similar to what got Mamdani elected, except that I'm not winning the primary, except that his messages are kind of like he goes to a spot where he thinks the current town government did something wrong and shows you a picture of it and says, this is what I would have done differently. And he's posting these rapid fire like almost every day. And then Jerry Halpin's doing a very face-to-face, meeting people and talking with them on the street, and
Go
Kevin,
door to door.
Yeah, I
in
don't
the
really know
community.
what his campaign style is. Maybe he doesn't know yet either. It's early yet, but I don't know where they'll get without
Is
cohesion. I
that,
mean, there's the Will
yeah, I mean,
Rogers
does
line.
that,
I'm
does
not
that,
a member of an organized party. I'm a Democrat, but it seems like that's where they're at.
Mm.
does that speak to a lack of leadership in the party, or is it,
Well, I think
I
they've
think it's
tried
kind of a
everything.
microcosm of
Yeah.
like the Democratic Party in general today, in terms
Right.
of like, there's this ongoing thing. Do we need to be more like Republicans and move center or
Well,
even
this is
right
like you
in
see,
order to?
there's a splitting of the
Well, let me just
party,
finish this thought.
right?
Like, it's like
Sorry.
in order to attract the people who are voting for Republicans, do we need to be more like Republicans, or do we need to be more like, left of center to get people who are not necessarily voting, and there's a lot of them, especially in
bring
local
them up?
elections, to come to the polls and vote for us. Like, this is a
Hmm.
debate that's going on, like, from Washington all through Albany and everywhere else. I mean, except for maybe someplace that's like New York City, that's totally blue, right? I mean,
Right. Yeah.
but anywhere that's like
It
split,
seems like that's where the energy is, though. You know,
where?
when you look at like Bernie Sanders, or you look at
Well,
AOC, or you look at Mamdani's primary. I mean, for the last 2 or more election cycles, I've been kind of curious, because when I talk to Democrats that I know, and especially young people, that
mhm.
they're the ones who are all feel the burn, and I was like, I was sort of learning about how, these decisions that were being made. I was curious because I didn't understand why there were such odds with the Democrats, especially the younger Democrats that I was talking to, and the decisions that seem to be made. I don't know. I'm seeing sort of
Well, you wonder why aren't
splitting
they
apart.
going? Why aren't they like going for that?
I think voters are reacting to two things right now. They're reacting to how genuine the campaign and the candidate seems to be, and they're reacting to populist messages. And that's not the ideology of those messages per se, it's that they're populist messages. So,
Right.
and and we're in a world where everything is manufactured for you. I mean, you have social media marketing people who make up all your Instagram posts, so you don't have to think about it. And people who are consuming this stuff know when it's fake.
It's true. And that's like the Gen Z, like the younger people, they are very in tune with, is this baloney, or is this really what this person's about? And you can tell that. So
I
I don't
honestly
know.
think a lot of it comes down to: are you trying to get new voters to the polls? I mean, it's like the Obama model, right? Are you trying to
Right?
pull new voters out to come vote, or are you trying to get better divvy up in your favor the existing voters who vote?
I think it's really interesting your point that it's sort of a microcosm for the National Party and some of the
Feels
issues
that way.
there. I think it was Tip O'Neill who said all politics is local, right? So we're
Mhm.
seeing that play out in Riverhead. We are out of time this week. I want to thank all of our panelists: Denise Civiletti of Riverhead Local, Beth Young of the East End Beacon, and Gianna Volpe of WLIW. Thank you guys for being with us. Thank you to my co-host Bill Sutton. I'm Joe Shaw. We'll be back next time with another edition of Behind the Headlines. Thanks, guys.